Thank you, Meredith. How's the volume? Everyone, can you hear me? I hope so.
Yes,
Okay.
you sound great.
Everyone. I'm speaking from not so sunny Charlotte, North Carolina. 2 inches of snow this morning. We're not escaping winter here either. So usually by this time of year we're getting some blooms on the cherries. Not this year. So I'm going to talk a little bit about elms. My interest in elms is from being a plant pathologist. I've dealt with Dutch elm disease and other diseases of elms for my entire career. And for the past 15, 20 years, I think we've had a good answer to many of these disease issues and pest issues of elms, and it is resistant species, resistant hybrids that are now available to us. And one of the problems I find is that there's still a large reluctance to use elms back on streets, elms in large-scale plantings. So a lot of times they're still not being spec'd out by landscape architects. There's still some reluctance to plant elms by urban foresters, city arborists. So that's my interest in trying to promote wider use of disease-tolerant and disease-resistant elms. So that's where I'm coming from. And let me see if I can move this along. Let's see. I apologize.
Bruce, do you see the little arrow there at the lower left of the presentation?
Thank you. So this is turn of the century, early 1930s, actually in the Northeast, could be the Midwest. Elms were our first shade tree used in the United States, used commonly throughout the eastern half of the United States. As the westward movement happened, elms were brought with them. So we saw elms being used as street trees in places like Denver and in around San Francisco. There are still large populations of elms left. Sacramento, we see them up in the Seattle, Portland area as well. So the American elm that has been native to the eastern half of the United States was used extensively throughout. And again, it was one of really our first shade tree that was used along streets. This is an early lithograph, early drawing of New Haven, Connecticut in the early 1700s, colonial times. And again, elms were used extensively in the town commons, town greens, very, very popular tree. And this is really the reason for its popularity. It's just an extremely durable, extremely tough tree. This is Charlotte, North Carolina. These are implanted American elms. They've come up from seed in the cracks of the sidewalk. They look beautiful. Few other trees would attain that size, attain that age in growing conditions like this. So an extremely urban tolerant species, and this is true of the hybrids that we are seeing as well. So certainly the unique base shape is one reason why it was popular. Very rapid growth rates, decay resistant. We've removed a lot of trees from Dutch elm disease, and it's surprising how many 100, 200-year-old trees are free of decay. Not too many species that can live that length of time and structurally be as sound as the American elms. Very easy to transplant, and this is one of the big reasons it was popular years ago. Tolerant of stress, very tolerant of change, so it's a good urban species that way. And unlike most pioneer species, early successional species, which elm fits in that category, it's also very long-lived. So this tree makes great growth, but also has very strong defensive mechanisms for decay and most native diseases. So this really makes it a very good urban species. But the problem with this species was the introduced diseases, and primarily Dutch elm disease has been the primary problem. And Dutch elm disease is a vascular disease. It affects the water conducting vessels, conductive vessels in the tree, caused by a fungus. All right. It's vectored by a bark beetle. So the fungus is from Asia, the bark beetle is from Europe, the primary one. We do have a native elm bark beetle, and also another newly introduced bark beetle that does vector this fungus. So that bark beetle feeds, breeds in the inner bark, cambial area of xylem of the tree, and that's the very place where the fungus will grow and develop as well. So what you see in the lower left-hand corner is the fruiting structures of the Dutch elm disease fungus that is growing in galleries. You can see that creamy head on it that contains millions of sticky spores. This is where developing broods, the immatures and mature, newly matured adult beetles come in contact with this fungus. It then moves from the brood tree and feeds in the crown on of healthy elms and introduces the fungus into the vascular system there. This fungus is also capable of moving through root grafts, and elms of the same species that are closely planted to one another, roots will graft and the fungus can move from one tree through to the other through the grafted roots. So very efficient means of moving tree to tree. It's not just Dutch elm disease. This is a huge problem. This is Elm Yellows. This is a mycoplasma disease, and the American elm is very susceptible to Elm Yellows. This particular disease, this mycoplasma is vectored by leafhoppers, and the mycoplasma actually colonizes the phloem tissues. It results in death of the root system that is manifested by a sudden yellowing and wilting death of the entire crown. So this is a major problem in portions of West Virginia. We're finding it in Maryland right now. There's resident populations in upstate New York. We also see it quite commonly throughout the Midwest. So this is a major disease of American elm as well, one that we don't have many good options for. So that is a concern. Eastern half of the United States, we see a lot of bacterial leaf scorch. From New York City southward, this is a very common disease of American elm, as well as many other tree species, oaks, platanus. We'll even see it occasionally on ash. But this is a bacterial disease. It's a vascular disease as well. Unlike the other diseases, Dutch elm disease and Elm Yellows, it doesn't cause a rapid mortality, but it does cause a devitalization of the tree. It weakens the tree and causes a gradual decline. So this is not, I would say elms are a major host of the Xylella, the bacterial leaf scorch pathogen, but certainly it is not uncommon to find bacterial leaf scorch, especially in northern Virginia. That seems to be an area where we see a good deal of bacterial leaf scorch on American elm. So this is another lethal disease that we do have to be concerned about. So as we start talking about resistance and tolerance to the various to Dutch elm disease specifically, we also have to be concerned about Elm Yellows and also with bacterial leaf scorch. And unfortunately, we don't know nearly as much about resistance or tolerance of the various elms to leaf scorch and to Elm Yellows that we know for Dutch elm disease. There's plenty of other pests of elm. Elm Leaf Beetle is one that gets a lot of attention, but Japanese beetles, there's a lot of scale insects. Aphids can be an issue. There can be leaf spot fungi that affect this tree. But again, in general, these are not lethal problems. These problems tend to fluctuate year to year, and generally elms are very tolerant of these sorts of pests. The big three that we worry about, we're concerned about, are Dutch elm disease, elm yellows, and bacterial leaf scorch. Those are the primary lethal ones. Dutch elm disease management tactics, it's an integrated approach that we take with Dutch elm disease management. Sanitation, there's vector management, chemotherapy, managing plant health, managing root grafts between trees, resistant species and varieties. And that's primarily what I'm going to talk about. Sanitation is very important, that where there is diseased elms, that they are removed promptly during the growing season and disposed of in a manner that will eliminate the vector, the bark beetle vector of that fungus. Vector management, treating elms with insecticides was quite common years ago in order to prevent beetle feeding. So this was very common in the 60s, 70s, and prior. Not done very often, and you can see why. Taking a persistent insecticide and trying to coat crowns of large trees isn't very practical anymore. So this is seldom done in terms of a management tool. But there are pheromone traps that can be used to monitor populations, can also be used in certain circumstances as a means to manage reduced populations. There is chemotherapy, two products that are commonly used for treatment of Dutch elm disease, Arbitect and propiconazole and thiabendazole. Those are the two most common materials to protect elms through injection. Plenty of research that documents efficacy. There's some other treatments out there, but certainly these are the two most common fungicides used to protect elms. And then there's resistant species and varieties. This chart was developed by Keith Warren, who was horticulturalist, a plant breeder, geneticist with Schmidt's nursery out in Warren, Oregon. And Schmidt's has done a great deal of work in terms of propagating, distributing, selecting even elms for resistance. So they probably offer around 20, 25 different species and varieties of elms now that are resistant to the various diseases. But this shows you some of the relationship, and we'll be talking about some of these species and varieties that are now available that show some resistance. Excuse me. So, American elm cultivars, we refer to these as resistant, but they're really not. A better word for American elm cultivars would be tolerant of Dutch elm disease. Tolerant really means that if you inoculate it with the Dutch elm disease fungus, usually symptoms develop. Symptoms of the disease will develop, and usually the tree recovers. Excuse me. That isn't always the case. Sometimes resistant trees or tolerant cultivars will actually decline and die. But most of these elm cultivars that are available today show a high degree of tolerance. The ones that I have listed here, New Harmony, Valley Forge, Princeton, Jefferson, those are known to show a high degree of tolerance to the Dutch elm disease fungus. Colonial Spirit is a new one that shows a great deal of promise. Liberty, I'll talk a little bit about Liberty. That doesn't show a great deal of promise. So the first four are the ones that are used most commonly today in terms of tolerant American elms. All these are very susceptible to elm yellows, be susceptible to leaf scorch, and would be susceptible to leaf beetles as well. So of the cultivars that are available, Valley Forge is probably the most popular out there, and it's also, I would say, from a form standpoint, the one you would want to avoid. So this has the highest degree of resistance or tolerance to Dutch elm disease from research studies. It says it has a classic elm shape, but I've never seen it in young ones that have been planted. It isn't one from a structural standpoint. And the next series slides, you can see the problem. That is a young Valley Forge on the left before pruning. And you can see that that central lead is curving over. It just wants to be one big branch. So the problem with this is trying to maintain that single dominant lead in the plant. Very fast grower. The side branches, you can see that side branch on the left. Let me grab that pointer. And that side branch is right here on the left. And you can see it is growing about as fast as the central leader. So that is certainly one of the problems with Valley Forge, and very popular 15 years ago and becoming less popular now. So this is not one I would particularly recommend, this particular cultivar. This is certainly after pruning. That's before pruning, after pruning, and you can see the problem with this species right in here is that this central leader that you see. Well, let me see if I can grab this thing. Well, I won't be able to do that. But the central leader and the side branch is growing basically at the same rate, and that central leader just doesn't stay dominant. It will begin to actually curve and become more lateral as a branch. So storm damage in this particular species is very common. Some nurseries have been able to produce decent form on 4 or 5 inch caliper stock, and it better maintains its form if you buy 4 or 5 inch caliper stock. But I'm not one to recommend large tree transplants. I prefer to use smaller stock that establishes more rapidly on site, and I just don't think this particular cultivar is one that is going to be sustainable down the road. A lot of information on pruning elms, and Valley Forge is a real challenge for producing a form. All elms, regardless of species, regardless of cultivar, do need routine structural pruning when they're young to produce a desirable form. Because of the nature of their upright growing habit, because of their rapid growth rate, once they're placed in full sun, form has to be trained from a very early age. And that has to start in the nursery and continue for at least the first 10 to 15 years after planting along the street. Many other species of trees requires a high degree of early structural pruning. Maples, for example, ash, for example, require about the same emphasis. New Harmony American Elm, it didn't get a good start. There were some problems with this tree in the nursery from a standpoint of producing the cultivar true to name, but that has been worked out, and the New Harmony that we have available today actually has very good form, very good growth rates, and very good resistance to disease. So this is another National Arboretum introduction. Classic vase shape. This is the mature tree that you see on the left, the original parent from New Harmony, Ohio, and it is one that shows a great deal of tolerance to Dutch elm disease, second to the Valley Forge in terms of its tolerance. A popular one, and probably the easiest one to find in the trade, is Princeton American Elm. This was actually developed by Princeton Nurseries in 1922. That's prior to the advent, the introduction of the Dutch elm disease fungus. So this was actually selected not for disease resistance, but for form. And it has a very nice elm, very nice form when it's mature, Young trees are quite easy to prune structurally relative to other elms. It turns out that it is highly tolerant of Dutch elm disease. So Princeton elm, which is one that can easily be found in the trade, is one of our better and more tolerant of the American elm cultivars. This is just a young Princeton elm, and you can see how easy it is to maintain that central lead, subordinate those lateral branches to keep a strong central terminal on. This is what you want to do at a young age, and Princetons are easy to do that. This is Jefferson, that looks very much like Princeton in early in the stages. Has that classic vase shape, and I can't unpark this. Pointer, but what you see here is the original Jefferson that is out on the mall in Washington. This was selected by National Park Service. This was a tree that was growing on the Washington Mall in the Capitol, and quite tolerant of Dutch elm disease from some scientific testing that was done on it. We can also see with this species the branch angles are more U-shaped as opposed to the branch angles in Princeton's Valley Forge, New Harmony. Typical elms have a very narrow V-shaped angle of attachment. So this is one of the advantages of Jefferson as well. Jefferson is beginning to be propagated more. We're finding it more commonly in the nursery now. I think Jefferson is one of our better ones as well. There's some confusion with nurserymen between Princeton and Jefferson. Some of the Jeffersons that have been sold out there are actually Princetons. That's being worked out as well. But one way you can separate a Princeton from a Jefferson is going to develop leaves, break bud a good 2 weeks earlier than any other elm that you have. Good full 2 weeks prior to Princeton, and it's going to hold those leaves much later into the fall. So this is one of the first trees to leaf out in the spring, first elms to leaf out in the spring, and one of the last elms to drop in the fall. And it's a good way to separate this tree from Princeton. These are two new American elms, Prairie Expedition. I don't know much about this. This is now being sold by Schmitz. It's being claimed to be disease resistant. Worth looking into from the standpoint of they seem to be promoting it for more drier climates. And some of these elms have been selected for greater drought tolerance. So when I was thinking Utah and the lower precipitation rates that occur in Utah relative to the eastern half of the country, Prairie Expedition might be one to look into a little bit more. Colonial Spirit isn't available yet, but this is another new Schmitz introduction, again being touted as disease resistant or disease tolerant, and that's one to look at from just another genotype out there that shows some resistance and has very good form. That is a strong central leader there. Apparently it's very easy to develop that strong central leader. So that's kind of the lineup on the American elms. The best certainly are New Harmony, Princeton, Jefferson. I can recommend those for specialty specimen plantings. Prairie Expedition is certainly worth looking into, and Colonial Spirit is coming along, not commercially available yet, but one to certainly pay attention to. Liberty Elm was, yes.
Bruce, we just had a couple of questions. Before we jump off of that, I wanted to see if you could answer, there was a talk in the chat pod about the St. Croix elm and that should be hitting local markets. Is that one that would be in that group that you mentioned
is now available? I don't
just
know
now?
much about it. We've been trying to
Are you
get
familiar with
St.
that?
Croix down here. into our arboretum. We do not have that one yet. We're just getting in the Prairie Sentinel this year and also the Colonial Spirit. But yes, St. Croix should be commercially available now. It's being touted as disease tolerant. This is one out of Minnesota, I believe, upper Midwest. So for colder areas of the country, particularly, I think this is going to be worth introducing or incorporating into landscapes. Where I see American elm being used is primarily as a specimen planting. It's in that historic area. It's for that consumer who wants an American elm, that residential property. I don't see it as a street tree for mass planting. I see it as a specimen planted tree because, again, we're not talking about a high degree of resistance. We're talking tolerance. And there's always more potential of loss with American elm than there is the other hybrids. But yes, thanks for reminding me about St. Croix. I should have included that. I've been just reading about that, but haven't gotten my hands on it.
We had one more quick question regarding that resistance, and it says, even if one of the newer elms is resistant to Dutch elm disease, can it still potentially spread Dutch elm disease to other non-resistant elms left in the city?
And, again, when we start talking about resistance with the American elm, what we're really talking about is tolerance. They're much more susceptible to the disease. They usually recover, but there is so much genetic diversity in the fungus population, in the population of the Dutch elm disease fungus, that there's always potential for a strain and isolate of the fungus to be capable of overcoming that resistance to American elm. So the resistance in American elm isn't nearly what we see in the Asian hybrids and some of the Asian European hybrids. Okay. Liberty, just a note about Liberty. It was developed.
Great, thank you. Sorry for the interruption.
I think at Wisconsin. It's now being sold by the Elm Research Institute. It's really a mixture of 6 American elm clones, and it's showing very variable disease resistance. So we've seen a lot of losses where Liberties were popular 20, 25 years ago. Certainly, this is not a tree that shows a great deal of dependable resistance or tolerance to Dutch elm disease fungus. There is talk of taking one of those clones, Independence, and just propagating that tree and releasing that tree. And that one may show a great deal more tolerance to the DED fungus than the generic Liberty elm, if you will. So that's one to consider if you do find Independence being sold, but I have not seen that in nurseries right now. I have seen Liberty being available, and that's not one I would recommend from disease resistance. I'm not going to talk much about Lacebark Elm Ulmus parvifolia, but that has been used a long time in the United States. It's hardy to zone 5, readily available in nurseries, lots of different cultivars available, and this tree shows a great deal of resistance to Dutch elm disease. I have seen one Ulmus parvifolia, one Lacebark elm become infected and die from Dutch elm disease. But for the most part, I would say this is highly resistant. I've seen thousands and thousands of these trees and never saw symptoms except in one. And that one was also mass attacked by Elmbark beetle. Generally a smaller tree, great bark characteristics on many of these cultivars, very much tolerant of stress. The downside I see with Lacebark elm is it tends to be invasive in certain areas. So no problems with this inner city. I do have problems with this as a suburban tree because of the potential of seedlings getting loose, if you will. So this is Lacebark. This is one of the seedling species that we have in our arboretum. Great bark. This one was actually named Bartlett by a horticulturist who is propagating it. Very small leaves, very fine textured plant. This is another problem with the lacebarks. You can see from the previous photos how dense those branch ends are. A lot of growth out on the ends. So this is not a species that handles ice storms very well. So wherever we see this planted in areas that are subjected with ice, we see a great deal of small branch failures. What you see here is typically what we see, 2-3 inch diameter branches failing in this tree. Sometimes it is larger leaders, but usually it's the smaller diameter. The popular ones that we see out there, Athena, LA, Dynasty, not so much Dynasty anymore, but Bosque and Everclear. So those are some of the varieties that are popular. A Lee is one of the most popular varieties. This is a Michael Durr introduction, University of Georgia. Beautiful tree from the standpoint of form, but this does not handle ice extremely well. So that upright ascending form is extremely popular as a street tree, but not so good in ice areas. Athena is much better where we have ice. You can see that rounded form, shorter leaders. This one handles ice quite well. So this is another UGA introduction, another Michael Durr introduction, and Athena is one to plant where you have ice. But a much more rounded crown, very different look than most elms. From a distance, it doesn't look like the typical elm. These are two other that I actually promote for inner cities. So Everclear is a fastigiate species. Great for inner city, great for next to power lines. Wherever you have limited space, this is a beautiful fastigiate species, upright species. And the other one that's getting a lot of emphasis right now we see in the southeast is Bosque Elm. And I think that's introduced by Select Trees out in Georgia as well. And you notice that strong central leader on the Bosque elm. It doesn't take much to produce that strong central leader. We think it's going to hold up the ice a lot better than, say, LE and Dynasty and some of the other elms that, Lacebark elms that are out there. So this is a very disease-resistant species, very insect-resistant species from the standpoint of leaf beetles. Japanese beetles we've seen very low problems with, Elm Leaf Beetle. Certainly Elm Yellows. I've never seen this in a Lacebark elm. And in Dutch elm disease, certainly highly resistant. These are suitable for mass planting, street tree planting. I would tend to use them inner city as opposed to suburban. This is another little-known Asian elm. This is Ulmus wilsoniana, and I will see this in nurseries. Very fast-growing, vase-shaped. Hard to tell it's vase-shaped from on the right, but it is a very vase-shaped species. Much larger leaf than the Lacebark elm, and this is Prospector. This is Ulmus wilsoniana. And the cultivar is Prospector. Again, we've seen no problems with this with Elm Yellows. I suspect that it's highly resistant to that disease, and certainly it's highly resistant to Dutch elm disease. So Prospector is just another species of elm that you can get out onto the landscape other than, say, just Lacebark, and it shows a great deal of promise for street tree planting. Like all elms, it's going to need some structural pruning when it's young, especially this species because it grows so rapidly. So that's the leaf. I should have an American elm leaf in there for comparison, but it's almost the same size as an American elm leaf. So very similar in terms of appearance. So these are the hybrids that are most popular. I see these in nurseries quite a bit. I see them in streets quite a bit. These Asian hybrids, I would say, have been used mostly in the Midwest and Northeast. We see them occasionally here in the South, in the southeastern United States, but they're popularity, I see them mostly in the northern half of the country, the Midwest and the Northeast. Again, high resistance to DED. We just have not seen Dutch elm disease in these varieties. We suspect that it has high resistance to elm yellows as well. Some of these are very susceptible to elm leaf beetles. Certainly some of them are very susceptible. Our Accolades and Triumph, Japanese beetle just love them. So we will get some defoliation during those years where we have heavy Japanese beetle. A little bit shorter in terms of their mature heights. Most of these are going to mature out around 60, maybe 70 feet, but generally a little bit smaller. So this is George Ware. He was a geneticist. He's since passed, but geneticist at the Morton Arboretum. Probably had about a 40-year career with him, with the Morton, and he is largely responsible for those crosses and for those hybrids. So a lot of these trademark cultivars that I just talked about actually will have Morton in their cultivar name. They came out of the Morton Arboretum. So this is a mature Accolade elm. George Ware did crosses between Ulmus japonica and Ulmus wilsoniana. The lumpers have gotten involved in this, and it turns out genetically that Ulmus wilsoniana is the same thing as Ulmus japonica. So what this is not a cross. It is actually a selection of Ulmus japonica. And some references indicate that it's Ulmus davidiana variety japonica. So these are the geneticists getting involved in this, but this is actually not a cross, or this is a cross between plants of the same species, essentially. So the name of it actually, according to the Morton now, is Ulmus davidiana variety japonica, Morton. Other people call this Ulmus japonica. Okay. Upright growth habit, zone 4 plant, solidly in zone 4. Does require the structural pruning, very glossy green leaves, very much an beige form. This is an excellent species. The ones that we have in our arboretum here, it grows better in zone 4 and 5 than it does in zone 8 where we are, but this is an excellent zone 8 species as well. Here's the Accolade that's growing in our arboretum. This is about a 14-year-old specimen. Just took this photograph the other day, and it's made good growth. Probably 10, 12-inch diameter right now, and established very well. This is Vanguard Elm, and I brought this one up. This is Ulmus japonica, and it's crossed with pumila, Siberian elm. So there's some Siberian genes in this one. And the reason I brought this up is for areas of Utah that are very dry. This is developed more for the plain states, more for dry area states. So you can see the weedy appearance of it, a little bit more weedy than the Accolade. A little bit lighter green color. Doesn't do as well in the heat of the southeast as the Accolade does, but certainly this is something that to consider in drier areas, let's say Utah, or drier areas of the plain states, because of that Siberian gene in there. You can see this is a 14, 15-year-old specimen growing here in Charlotte, and you can see the form isn't nearly as good on this tree as it is on the Accolade, but I suspect that it would perform much better in drier climates. Triumph elm is a cross between Accolade and Vanguard, and this is one of my favorites. The photo you see on the right of the tree is growing in the Morton Arboretum in Chicago. It's probably been there about 8 or 9 years from a small whip. Very, very good growth rate. This is growing in a stone walkway, very high stress area. That tree just stays real deep green. What you're seeing on the left is the comparison of an American elm leaf with an Accolade. I'm sorry, with a Triumph. And you can see that the Triumph leaf, the Accolade leaf, is a good, half the size, maybe a little less than half the size of an American elm leaf, but twice the size of, say, a Lacebark elm. So it's a much coarser crown on it. Most consumers wouldn't know the difference between a Triumph elm, an Accolade elm, and an American elm. They'd have to look carefully. So these mimic American elm very, very well, but have that high degree of disease resistance. Others that are commonly used, I see Donata. This is Morton redtip, Morton Stalwart, which is Commendation elm. So what we're seeing here, they're typically referred to as Accolade, Triumph, Donata, Commendation, Vanguard. Those are all trademarks. So those are the trademark names. The actual cultivar name is generally named after the Morton. And both these species are excellent. Commendation, particularly from a growth rate. The downside on Commendation, you really have to stay on top of it from a pruning standpoint because the growth rates are so rapid on this tree. So probably shortening up pruning rotations. It would probably need structural pruning on the street every 2 to 3 years, probably for the first 10 or so to get a decent form out of it because of those strong growth rates. But both of these are excellent hybrids that have come out of the Morton Arboretum. And I think these these 5 that I talked about are really the ones that show a great deal of potential for replacement along streets, replacement of American elm. There are some European and Eurasian hybrids. A lot of these came out of the USDA breeding programs, came out of the National Arboretum. So this is Pioneer elm, more of a rounded crown, very fast growth, does extremely well in Charlotte. So this is actually wick elm, Ulmus glabra, and smoothleaf elm. This is actually 2 European elms. So I would be a little bit hesitant about using Pioneer as a major planting along the streets, but certainly can be incorporated in. I'm a little bit worried about stable form of resistance considering its heritage. But certainly research does show that it's highly resistant to Dutch elm disease and has a little bit different form than normal elms, the typical elm, I would say. And certainly the foliage is very striking. This is Frontier elm. The claim to fame of Frontier is the red fall color, burgundy fall color. In Charlotte, North Carolina, that's a stretch. I have not seen beautiful red fall color in any of my travels from this particular selection. Although, if you read the press on it, it has a burgundy red fall color. So that's about as red as I've ever seen it in Charlotte, North Carolina, that lower slide. But it does have great upright base shape, a very rapid growth form, a little bit smaller leaf than the Accolade and the Triumph, and very stable forms of resistance. We're looking at a smoothleaf elm, parvifolia, crossed with parvifolia, which is the Lacebark elm. Solid in zone 5, I think it'd be pushing it in zone 4. So this is a little bit warmer climate elm. Does extremely well here in Charlotte, and one that I would strongly recommend. Just don't count on a consistent fall color, at least in warmer areas of the country. Patriot elm, I included this one for the Boston fans in the group. This is a complex hybrid. There's a little bit of everything in Patriot. Very upright form, especially when it's young. It's beginning to spread a little bit more now in our arboretum. Very rapid growth rates, that dark green summer foliage, very leathery foliage. This one has a little bit different look than the American elm, not the typical vase shape, more of an upright shape, but I think this is worth consideration where you can find Patriot. Popular at one point. I'm not seeing a lot of Patriots used right now in being grown in the nursery. So not nearly as common. This is Patriot in our nursery now. This is about a 7-8-year-old tree from a whip that was planted out, and again, it's growing extremely well. Very few problems with this tree. Pretty easy to get a decent form on it. We need to prune it again this year, but it's pretty easy to produce a decent head on it. These are some of the older varieties. Homestead, can find it in nurseries yet, but I'm not a big fan. Doesn't perform well here in Charlotte. I've seen some issues with this in places like New York City. Makes very rapid growth when it's young, performs extremely well when it's young, but after age 10, 15, I've started seeing problems with it. Sapsuckers just absolutely love this plant for whatever reason. So the specimens we have in our nursery are just devastated by sapsucker, interestingly enough. We never see damage on our other cultivars, very seldom. This is Regal, again, another upright form, very complex hybrid. This one does well here in our arboretum. Very good species, although I'm not seeing too many, or very good hybrid cultivar, but I'm not seeing too much of this in nurseries as well. And then urban elm, which was very popular 25, 30 years ago, but has proven to be one that has a lot of issues with canker disease and with insect problems as well. So the urban elm, which came out with a lot of fanfare in the 80s, hasn't proven to be a real good species. And we knew that after about year 5 or 6 due to the canker diseases on stressful sites. So urban is not one that you can find much anymore, and one that not one that I would recommend. So with elms, I hope we never see anything like this again. I hope we've learned our lessons with monoculture. This is not what we're kind of advocating, is the alleles of American elm, or certainly even the alleles of some of these hybrids. But certainly where American can be used is places like this, historic sites, town greens, feature areas. If a homeowner, consumer, residential customer, or commercial account wants an American elm, a college campus wants an American elm, I think those tolerant cultivars, those tolerant selections, such as New Harmony, Jefferson, Princeton, St. Croix, those are all excellent additions to the landscape as that feature tree. These hybrids are phenomenal as far as I'm concerned, but they're not American elms. They'll never reach the height, the stature, just not the same. So I see a place for American elm, but it's not as mass planting. It's not long rows of the same species. So where I see the mass plantings being done is many of these hybrids, the Accolades, the Triumphs, the Donated Charm, the Frontiers. I think they're suitable for wider planting, more numerous planting, integration into our streets. They have the same upright form, strong growth rates, great survivability following transplanting. As long as you get green side up, these plants generally thrive in stressful sites. So I see the hybrids and the cultivars being used in these types of situations. So I'm about wrapping up. Anyone know what that is? That's a English elm in Central Park. One that is very sensitive to disease, but that's the English elm in flower, and probably one of the prettiest times to see English elm is when it's in full bloom. That's a very heavy bloom set. So if there's any questions, I'll be glad to try to handle them. I'm almost on time.
Great. Thank you so much, Bruce. There are a couple of questions here, folks asking about specific varieties. There's a New Horizon question or an Emerald Sunshine. How about those particular species?